Welcome to the Designing Music Now podcast, a podcast dedicated to the art and technique of creating music for video games and interactive media. I'm Dale Crowley.
And I'm Michael Sweet.
And today we are very honored to have with us Barney Pratt, who is the audio director of Supermassive Games that has released the super popular teen horror survival game Until Dawn. And today we'll be talking with him about the music and the implementation system that he used in that game. Welcome, Barney.
Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks, Dale.
Before we start, let's listen to a few excerpts from the upcoming interview with Barney Pratt.
Now, you know what was interesting about Until Dawn was we realized early on that a kind of more modern stems and states mix just wasn't going to give us the nuance, subtlety that we wanted. One of the big tenets of the game was to have the game as interesting for the person sitting next to the player in the room as the player. I think we had a budget of about an hour's worth of music, and we did a slightly vain check in the game to find out how much original music had actually gone into the game. And I think we ended up with 8.5 hours of original music cues in the game across the wider arc. We'd want that theme to just tease a little, so the melodic elements within the stems could come in and tease within other more ambient or more abstract cues. Mm-hmm. Leading up to perhaps the kind of the classic boss battle at the end. You would have heard elements of that theme that Jason composed leading up to that section, but only on that section would we literally put all 19 stems in, or further add other stems. And but randomization, no matter how hard we tried, randomization just wasn't going to give us that kind of control, that subtlety. So if you give them an indication that there's something behind that door, for example, which is, a strong indication is a violin riser or some form of gliss leading up to the door. If you give them an indication of something there, you're kind of forcing them to walk into their own fear. Do you know what the one thing I got from that, regardless of whether it was music or anything else, was that the players were generally getting very immersed and were very reactive in the right ways, in the ways we wanted them to be. And I think for us, that just gave us a lot of confidence in what we were doing.
And just before we get started with the musical questions, let's delve into your background a little bit. Let's talk about your career path from Warner Brothers through EA, and then how you got into Supermassive, and how you basically developed an interest in game audio. Well,
I kind of came from originally a music background. We had a little record label making underground techno, and I sort of decided at that stage it wasn't going to be enough to pay the rent. So we thought we'd move on. And through the sort of knowledge gained learning how to make music with computers, I moved on to do tech support for the music system. So there was a time we were tech supporting Pro Tools, and this was back on kind of version 4, version 5 days, through the early Logic in Cubase. And after a while, I was lucky enough to get poached out of the tech support into the film industry, and had a really good run with Warner Brothers in the UK when the tax breaks were in their favour. So did some nice films, some big films, worked with some amazing people in film sound. And I think it was an old audio director of mine, Adele Kellett. She got in touch from EA and said, would I be interested in working with the Harry Potter team at EA? Previous to that, I'd been working on the Harry Potter films, and they were chatting with Warner Brothers about making the game's more filmic. So they had, I kind of fitted the bill for them, really. Lucky enough to get a job with them. My interest in game sound then only grew as I realized the opportunities that were available to you, and the kind of the growth, the innovation, the who dares wins aspect of it all. And it really did favor the bold, whereas the film industry technically was on a very kind of linear path. It had just gone to digital. People were kind of adjusting to that, whereas I might have had a reputation in the film industry of being technical. When I came into the games industry, I realized how much I had to learn, and that was standing at the bottom of a big mountain. It felt like an amazing place to be, and just never looked back since, really.
Wonderful.
One of the questions that we wanted to get right into was how the interaction works between an audio director and that's doing a game and, say, the composing department. And so when you're putting together a creative brief for a composer or the direction for a project, what kinds of things do you put together? how are you initially working with a composer on a project to kind of create the overall creative direction for a project?
Well, it's kind of different project to project. Until Dawn, we did a lot of early previs work with, even when we were at storyboard stage, we'd mock up videos from the storyboards and lay up commercially available soundtracks. And we in-house, we had about a 10-minute previs, storyboard previs with a combination of a Marco Beltrami soundtrack, Scream 4, which gave us kind of, for us, one end of the spectrum, really strong kind of Hollywood orchestral horror. And then the other soundtrack that was featuring a lot, and it was Christopher Young, The Grudge, which is just a really edgy, sensitive soundtrack, which was a really good counterbalance to the Marco Beltrami. And I can't remember whether we went to Jason Graves for Until Dawn with that piece. I think he saw it at some point, but I think we held that back. And actually, we developed our ideas internally, which we then went to him with in a text form as adjectives and kind of bold statements. We want, it shall. In fact, I dug out the music brief.
Great.
For Until Dawn. I mean, I haven't looked at this for a good couple of years, and I was surprised actually how similar it was. We gave Jason a broad overview, so it was a true meeting of film and game. We hope this will be exciting for Jason, of course, because he's got a strong background in film as well as the game. Mm-hmm. We wanted it narrative driven. It was about storytelling. There were character themes. This is a quote from the brief. Character themes will work within the more generic elements. I mean, this was true throughout the game. And every technical effort will be made to allow huge interchangeability between all compositions. That was clearly a bold statement that we hit about 50, 60%, something like that, but clearly not everything could be interchangeable, but a bold start. So we kept it open. We added words like Hollywood teen horror, filmic, supernatural, scary fun rather than scary serious. We actually got more scary serious as it went on. But we also opened it up. We suggest things like a rich orchestral and synth elements. We wanted to sort of create a space within a genre for Jason to create his originality. And I think it's important not to, if you go to someone like Jason for his background, you want him to bring his style to the project. And so it'd be incorrect of us to try and enforce a style upon him. And he did a great job of bringing that forward, of developing an original soundtrack. So I think the key thing is building that relationship, that openness for creativity, and inviting them to kind of be part of the team in a way, rather than enforcing your ideas upon them, really.
So I'm going to play a few of the songs. I'd like to just sort of get your thoughts and your comments as they stir up memories during the, as I play them back. Just any thoughts that you have about the thematic development or the instrumentation and orchestration. The first one is Shadow of the Mountain.
Yeah. This was actually, this was the pitch piece, Jason, and I think it went through to final game actually completely unchanged. It was one of three pieces. It was from the triad of things. There was Mountain, Youth, and Killer, and they were kind of the three pieces that we kept going back to. And it was meant to be the signature piece for the game, which embodied the entire narrative arc, the surroundings. And this is what we started off as a brief for this. Really, it was the notes written down. It's the scale of the mountain settings, that enormity, the industrial backdrop of the mines, and the forces of nature work on the mountain.
Great. Let me go ahead and play Run or Hide, and that seems to be in two parts. The first part hiding, and the second part running.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, so here's Run or Hide.
That's Run or Hide. That's you're right, absolutely right. That's in two parts. The might be three parts actually. Thinking about it, I think the first section was based around something we originally called the youth theme, which formed one of the triads of themes. And I think halfway through it gets interrupted by the killer theme. That's where it darkens. I can't remember, it's kind of like a music box instrument that plays over that transition, I think, which just hangs in the air. And that's just a classic horror trick. You leave something hanging longer than it should be to cause that discomfort, which is a great trick. And I think the piece it then goes into was, I think originally it was one of the generic pieces, but it got so well used, we kind of grew it more into a theme. I think it was called Action Panic 6, or something equally as nasty and generic as like that at the start. But that's, yeah, I think that's like a full-on kind of 7/8 rapid percussion off the top of my head. Yeah, that was a very well-used piece, especially early on for some of the early chases.
Great, and then some of the other themes that I really liked were Chris and Ashley and Mike and Jessica. Those are very different than your traditional horror. In other words, they have a lot of heart, they have a lot of softness and beauty to them. Here's Chris and Ashley.
Yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on Chris and Ashley's thing. We've talked about this one for ages. It was, like you say, it was a counterpoint to the driving horror, dread, and fear. It's about the relationship and how it progresses between Chris and Ashley across the narrative arc. They start off, they're kind of nervous liaison. They both like each other. No one wants to kind of put their neck on the line, as it were. And we were able to do a lot with this theme. We used it in a number of different situations, from that first meeting right through to emanating from some of the darkest, kind of heaviest tonal or atonal elements, while Chris is confessing his undying love to Ashley. But of course it might be too late in the situation they're in further down the line, with something hanging over their heads. But the strings. The strings from that piece certainly were able to just emanate from some of the darkest depths of some of the other themes.
Fantastic. And then in contrast, quite a bit, Mike and Jessica is much more heavily thematic, and almost it sounds like the mountain theme is part of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, actually. I remember listening to that. So the Mike and Jessica, again, this started off as a fairly generic piece very early on in the compositions. But as ever, it was a strong piece from Jason. And as I would have adapted some of the early generic pieces into character themes, this one just favoured Mike and Jessica. It favoured their action in the game. It favoured their narrative path, their narrative arc. It's quite playful. As a couple, they're a very kind of energetic, fun-loving couple, and the mountain theme worked into that. Definitely gives it that kind of strength. And then I think that piece ends on one of the suspense exploration pieces, which tells their story of how their narrative arc progressed, how they were forced to investigate a certain situation and investigate that situation further, of course.
Fantastic. And you often mix three different themes, or Jason did, in the same song. Tell us how that worked and how that came about.
Well, it was funny when he was putting together the soundtrack. He wanted feedback from me about exactly which pieces had been used where exactly. So I did exactly that. And these were the key themes that matched those characters through their passage through the game, really.
And so you had obviously tempo synced themes or stems that he sent, but were they also harmonically in sync, I suppose, so that you didn't get some really bad sounding clashing notes?
Well, do you know what the way we had the music delivered from Jason? It was so wide on the stems. There was within those stems there was a real mix of classic tunes, melodies, etc., alongside fantastic abstract or aleatoric stems.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was able to do was allow the thematic pieces to kind of come in, do their thing. Then I was able to resolve using the stems to different stems, loops, for example, or sort of things that I could have other control over. I could really sort of minimize and come out on maybe a single held note, for example, and have that looping just as a really sort of tense bed for a short period of time. So I would essentially pass the harmonic responsibility over to Jason and then be able to extract exactly what I needed from those stem setups.
Very cool.
So what you're kind of speaking about is getting sort of Pro Tool stems and then almost doing a lot of the implementation. So Jason writes, stuff comes to you, then you're able to kind of pull it into the game and then finesse out transitions from, say, one section to another based on sort of editing those stems, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I wouldn't say it's a common trend, and yet I wouldn't want to do it any other way. And I think the relationship that we built with Jason was one of very sort of open creativity. We built a lot of trust between us that he would handle the overall style of a piece on a brief of adjectives, of words and description, etc. And when that arrived to me, it would be a very full piece, generally not more than a couple of minutes long, but it would be broken down into stems so much that I could derive additional minutes, additional forms. So in many ways, I was reducing what he was delivering to fit the game better. And in the same way that we created space for his creativity to input into the game, by the same token, he trusted me to rearrange those pieces to fit the game even more closely than anyone could have originally intended before that section of the game was finished, really.
So one follow-up question, which relates more about how Jason was ultimately chosen for the project. Did you have him put together demos, and did those demos then make it into the game? And or when after Jason was hired, was there a process of sort of honing in on that right direction, or did that come sort of right away?
Yeah, good questions. I'm trying to think back to the process now. I think because it was an original IP, we knew we had to take a bit of time forming our own opinions and sort of finding the right person for the job. The piece that won us over was the mountain theme, the Shadow of the Mountain. I think the piece, or that cue, I think on the soundtrack is actually Jason's pitch piece.
Wow.
And I think it literally went through to game verbatim.
Wow.
And it was so strong, it owned the style, and it gave us so much to work with.
Mm.
But instantly you kind of think, okay, that's great. This is not only has he got the style bang on, he's going to give us something we can really work with, and therefore something we can then better still into the game. So yeah, very strong piece.
And I understand he delivered as many as 19 stems for different tracks. Can you break those down into the different, like, were there obviously ambiences, percussion, strings, horns, and all of those things, but were they melodic? Were they broken down into sections of melodic stems and, I guess ambient stems and so on, or beds, pads, sort of thing? How did you work with all of those? And did you randomize them in the game to provide, a lot more variety as a player would go through the same scene, perhaps multiple times?
And what was interesting about Until Dawn was we realized early on that a kind of more modern stems and states mix just wasn't going to give us the sort of the nuance, subtlety that we wanted. One of the big tenets of the game was to have the game as interesting for the person sitting next to the player in the room as the player.
Cool.
And to have that filmic subtlety. I mean, from the outset, Pete Samuels and Will Biles were looking really closely at fantastic facial animation, body animation techniques. The characterization was going to be absolutely key. And we had to follow up with the sound. We needed all those similar subtleties that you get with really good facial animation to exactly fit the beats of the scene. So, I mean, it wasn't our intention, but we kind of rebelled slightly against more modern traditional game audio techniques, more open world traditional game audio techniques in terms of kind of stem states mixing. And we tried to control, and we had an opportunity to control larger sections of music. So rather than the stems being delivered in sections which we could then randomize, we would absolutely tailor, whether it be during an open-ended exploration section, we just make sure that loop would have enough sensitive ebb and flow to not get boring, to not sound repetitive, because I think what did we had a budget of about an hour's worth of music, and we did a slightly vain check in the game to find out how much original music had actually gone into the game. And I think we ended up with 8.5 hours of original music cues in the game.
Yeah.
I think I can list on one hand the ones that we repeated, and these were the really kind of very simple kind of one single hanging string that was just too good to miss out on, really. But we did not repeat any of the music cues. Now, that's not to say that we didn't repeat some of the stems, because we want, across the wider arc, we're looking at 6 to 8 hours of gameplay. Across the wider arc, we'd want that theme to just tease a little, so the melodic elements within the stems could come in and tease within other more ambient or more abstract cues, leading up to perhaps the kind of the classic boss battle at the end. You would have heard elements of that theme that Jason composed leading up to that section, but only on that section would we literally put all 19 stems in, or further add other stems.
So you pre-rendered them, more or less. I mean, you pre-rendered for each particular scene and for each particular section, and also that allowed you to play the proper motifs. So when it was Chris and Ashley, you could play their motif on cue without it relying on some random system.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, I mean, even down to the stings, the kind of scare stings. There was a couple of sound design samples that featured pretty heavily in all of them. But I honestly think that every single stem was different, because sting, because every single sting needed a different emotional push, and was in a different situation. So a kind of a heavy sting in one scene might actually be just slightly different than a heavy sting in another scene. Again, I don't think we used the same sting twice throughout the game. But they were for the determinate sections. But of course, the trick was to try and keep that consistency across the indeterminate sections. And but randomization, no matter how hard we tried, randomization just wasn't going to give us that kind of control, that subtlety.
So one of the things that we read in another interview, you talked a little bit about like raising up the volume dynamically of a violin as the play got close to a door, and you just mentioned the indeterminacy in a way. Can you describe other kinds of events in the game where you utilize those kind of techniques, or other places in relation to how the story was going, in order to keep it a little bit varied for players that were either playing it a second time on a different path or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that interestingly, that what seems like a very simple thing, the riser to the door. I had my doubts about it initially. I thought, this is going to get boring very quickly. Of course, we had to be careful how many times we used it. But the interesting thing about it was players. Obviously, there's an understood language of gameplay, and one of the pieces that most players understand is they want to progress the game. So if you give them an indication that there's something behind that door, for example, which is, a strong indication is a violin riser or some form of gliss leading up to the door. If you give them an indication of something there, you're kind of forcing them to walk into their own fear, which we found was actually increased the engagement, increased the immersion in that situation. Of course, in terms of tailoring that, there's all the combinations of riser to sting, riser to no sting, so you could play a little joke with them and just make them question whether they're going to get one the next time. Maybe a riser to no sting, then sting. There's just simple combination switches at different times. I'm trying to think of what we did a couple of times. There was quite dense, quite detailed choices, short chases toward a cabin, for example. And I know during those sections we had a short section of a stem states mix with a quite simple kind of, I think it's 4 layers of intensity affecting the volumes on, I think it was about 5 or 6 stereo stems, or varying kind of driving intensities or backed off intensities. And because the sections were so detailed, we didn't want to wait for the next beat or bar to make that transition. We wanted to actually improved our control in those situations to go back to a stem states mix. But that was the rare case.
So were there ever any times where you did not increase the volume? In other words, I think one of the things that I heard that you did was try to make sure there was a lot of variation, make sure there was a lot of, in other words, you didn't want people to be able to anticipate when the danger was coming. So were there times where they would walk up to the door and you intentionally did not increase the volume or play some sort of a sting?
No, you're absolutely right. In one of those combinations that I missed out, I think, was silence, then sting. But I mean, it seems overly simplistic to say it like that. But if you mix it up well enough, you can kind of just play tricks on the player, really.
Right. So what other types of techniques did you use to increase the horror effect? For example, did you change tempo? Did you change key? Maybe rising from a D sharp to a C sharp. Was that something that had to be pre-recorded and thought out beforehand? Were those kinds of things that you used, sort of the pre-lap or the prelapse idea of, the precognitive idea of, increasing the intensity before something happens?
Yeah, what we found was, as an indicator, increasing the intensity as a regular kind of tactic would actually set the expectation of the player quite high. So we, more often than not, went to a reduction, like as a pre-lap. We would want to reduce and create some space for the impact. We did a lot of mix snapshots around that to bring other elements out before a scare. I think we had a mix snapshot of we go from normal through pre-scare, which would just back off the ambience a touch more, just bring the dialogues down a touch. And then, of course, we had action and chase, which would just bring all the right elements back up. But sorry, just going back to something you were saying, Michael, about the different choices and the replayability. What we found was, so long as we were editing music, which absolutely fitted the scene or the section of the game, each separate path led itself to have a completely different cue. So we were continually re-deriving from the previous sequence, the ongoing choices, and you can imagine that branches quite rapidly. But as long as we were following the narrative arc correctly, then we could guarantee a separate piece on each path.
Cool. So you also mentioned snapshots, which I think is really interesting. This gets more on the technology side. Can you briefly overview the system that you implemented with? Do you use middleware for this? Did you find you needed it? And when you're talking about mixer snapshots and things like that, where were you defining those within the architecture of the game?
So yeah, our audio middleware choice was Wise from Audiokinetic. Can't sing its praises enough. The Wise technology is it's just a very solid feature set. It's an absolutely reliable piece of kit. And the way that we implemented snapshots into the game was using a states method on the bus actor mixer hierarchy. Simply doing combinations of high pass, low pass change and volume change on those buses. We had a very filmic mix, as in kind of a pre-mixed set of buses. So it was quite a narrow subset. So we could change the effect of these states on the volumes of each bus very easily because it was quite a finite set. I think there's probably two other ways I can think of doing it, but that was a really reliable way of doing it for us. The nice thing about that is you're always in one state or another. You're not chasing various different RTPC settings, etc.
One of the biggest challenges with working on a game that is 7 or 8 hours long is jumping into the middle of the game to check the mix on a specific. Can you talk a little bit about the audio team QA, kind of going back, or the mix that you had in terms of going to a specific? Did you have tools that were built specifically to allow you to go to certain sections of the game, test it, remix, things like that? How efficient was that process?
Yeah, good question. I mean, what we tried to do, we weren't a big team working on it. We maxed out around 5 people, and that was only really towards the end. There's a lot of gameplay, a lot of content that went in. We tried to build a mix that would have a kind of A to B philosophy. So, for example, taking the Foley for a long sequence, if that WAV was authored, if it was authored at max volume with some internal mixing, that WAV could be dropped into the right place in the actor-mixer hierarchy and subsequently get the correct volume, attenuation, busing structure, and therefore mix. So in theory, the majority of the stuff would go in with a kind of initial philosophy attached to it, and then basically sort itself out. Obviously, there's exceptions to all the rules. One of them being the music. For the one thing we didn't do with the music was have it running through any of the mix states, any of the mix snapshots. So we allowed it to be free, and which gave us a hell of a lot of freedom. And like you say, dropping into the middle of the game, you'd often find a cue that might be, a little hot. I think that was generally the case. So we'd have to back them off during the mix. But yeah, we tried to create a structure in the project where assets could hit the project and essentially get their mix from then on up till they come out the speakers.
Very cool. And in terms of the QA process, was that really something that you were able to jump around and listen to? And were you responsible for the final mix?
Yeah. We had a good couple of weeks to do the sort of final tweaks, but we knew that was going to be a finite time at the end of the project. We knew it was going to be pushed quite hard. Hence, kind of try and do as much pre-work on that as possible in the project. It was good the way the project was managed. I mean, the guys did a great job here. We would work in shortish sections, and I think the music was one of the main culprits for this. But we always had to think that we were holding something back for later. Mm-hmm. We always had to think of the wider narrative arc. It was a big drive for the project that narrative and storytelling would be king. Characterization would be king. Like I said, really the strength of the facial animation, and we wanted the same with the music. Not only did we not want the repetition, we wanted to tease in and out with the themes. The first glimpse of the killer, we just tease in with the killer theme. Then you might not hear it for a few levels after that. But I think always keeping it was a very manual process, really. We always kept an eye on what was coming and where this sat in the wider narrative arc, and always held something back in reserve. Always keep something in the bank, right? Always keep savings.
And I read that the beta testers were actually hooked up to galvanic skin testers to test if they were sweating and so on during the testing. Did they react to the music? Was the music part of that beta testing? And were you able to tweak the music in any way, like in terms of adding more stingers or taking some out based on the lab tests?
Do you know what the one thing I got from that, regardless of whether it was music or anything else, was that the players were generally getting very immersed and were very reactive in the right ways, in the ways we wanted them to be. And I think for us that just gave us a lot of confidence in what we were doing. it's very difficult to break down the exact detail of those situations. But you, as a unified experience, you can tell whether you've got it or not in a certain situation. And as a team, we reacted accordingly to a lot of those tests. But the reactions were more around timings, more around horror timings of certain events, as opposed to restructuring certain elements. There was a kind of an overhaul. Well, that one worked. Let's try and use that somewhere else. Let's use that philosophy somewhere else.
And how did you combine the sound design with the music and vice versa? I mean, using the music as sound design for the stingers, for the jump scares and those kinds of things. How was that interaction?
Do you know what? I really feel like the combination of music and sound design just became a completely grey. I find it really hard to decipher. You know, having worked with, because you can get away with so much with aleatoric material, that it was just a hotbed of combining, and that goes absolutely true for the sound design elements, for the the huge anvil stings, the soft whispers that feel too close to you, that kind of thing. I think, yeah, I mean, if it helped immersion, if it helped a visceral response, we'd use it. It was fairly shameless in that respect. And yeah, hopefully to a good end, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Barney, thank you very, very much for your time today. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about in depth about this amazing game that you developed the sound and music for.
Well, I hope it's been,
work.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's, it's certainly been enjoyable. It's nice to relive it all.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Lovely. Thanks very much. All the best.
Okay. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Designing Music Now podcast, a podcast dedicated to the craft of creating music for video games and interactive media. Please visit us at designingmusicnow.com for more info, news, and reviews on this subject. We would love to hear from you.